of the Spanish. On the other side of the debate was the idea that perhaps these are not people with souls, perhaps these are people who are natural slaves. And in that context, they could be coerced to produce labor.
What Las Casas wanted to do was to change the policy of the Spanish crown towards the Indians. So paradoxically, he was able to get slavery of Indians banned. That's something which the Spanish crown bans, outlaws. And by 1542, the laws have been changed to ensure that there can no longer be Indian slaves. But Las Casas also suggests that the labor shortfall in America can be made up with black slaves from Africa, which I think he later regretted, later in life.
It's a key moment insofar as the reflection on the system that produces race is there in that debate. The system that produces race, which will produce race over the next 200-300 years, is that colonial system, which takes this diverse range of peoples and defines them as Indian, forces that category on them. And it's in that context that you begin to see two things that go hand in hand with the development of racism. On the one hand, the institutions that keep in place exploited populations, oppressed populations, and in that context, the debates that then take place as to what kinds of populations they are. These debates begin with lawyers, they move to anthropologists, and then they move on to biologists, always debating within that context of colonialism, which fixes those people as objects of investigation.
Thursday, 11th October. Thus far and no land. Another 12 hours will decide.
A crucial moment in the racial history of the whole Atlantic world and of the world is Christopher Columbus, but not the first voyage, which everybody knows about, but the third voyage in 1498. Columbus sailed south to Sierra Leone, where, as he noticed, the people are very black, perfectly black. And then he sailed due west from Sierra Leone, and he wound up near Trinidad and the northern coast of South America. And he reported that the people there were white with blonde hair. And that shouldn't have happened according to the prevailing theories of skin color in the whole classical world in the medieval period. What happened with Columbus is that people started to realize that you could stay on the same latitude and get radically different skin colors. And if that was the case, then there had to be some other explanation for skin color other than geography. So that's where you begin to get the emergence of biological theories of difference in skin color. And that leads eventually to racist theories of differences in skin color.
And so a view emerges, originally identified as pre-Adamism, that maybe there are multiple origins and that less civilized, more primitive human beings have an origin that is not accountable for by a biblical narrative, but are closer to the animal world. And that view then develops into a view called polygenism, that is multiple origins.
When Europeans first encountered chimpanzees, they were really struck by the similarities between what we now call chimpanzees and humans. But they called chimpanzees drills. And one of the questions that John Locke talks about in his essay concerning human understanding is the question of whether human beings have mated with drills. So the question that gets increasingly asked in the 17th century is, are African peoples what we would call the same species as Europeans? And Locke has real questions about whether we can say that they're the same species or not. And one of the explanations for African people that you start hearing in Barbados, for instance, the English colony on Barbados in the 17th century, is that black Africans are produced by the sexual union of a chimpanzee and a human being. So they're not really human, they're half animal. And this gets bound up with a whole series of prejudices about the animality of Africans, their bestiality, their sexuality is animalistic. Even in the 20th century, you get all sorts of claims about jazz music being animalistic. These are prejudices that begin to be ingrained in European culture in the 17th century in the context of what we think of as major scientific or philosophical texts.
And literary texts too. In The Tempest, whichever way you interpret Caliban, Shakespeare's weird hybrid reinforces the idea that slaves are not fully human.
Shakespeare doesn't quite know how to figure the hewer of wood and drawer of water. Is this the working class? Is this the proletariat? Is this the African? Is this the savage? Shakespeare doesn't know, and he creates Caliban.
Thou poisonous slave, got by the devil himself upon thy wicked dam, come forth!
In The Tempest, it seems to me pretty clear that Shakespeare imagined Caliban as a black slave. He has an African mother and a black devil father, and that in some ways Caliban is the first representation of the rebellious, sexually obsessed, violent, ignorant black slave.
I have used thee, filth as thou art, with human care, lodged thee in mine own cell, till thou didst seek to violate the honor of my child.
Would it have been done? Thou didst prevent me. I had peopled else this isle with Calibans.
Shakespeare presents him as somebody who will be tricked by a few baubles, not crystal meths, not crack cocaine, but by a few trinkets and some booze.
Many a Caliban might have found himself in the English plantations of America. In fact, The Tempest was partly inspired by the story of a ship which ran aground on Bermuda, where the crew then mutinied. The Sea Venture had been bound for the plantations of Virginia, a slaveholding colony in which Shakespeare himself had a financial investment.
The economic notion of the plantation as a large site of agribusiness and of a large cooperation of human labor for the arable field begins in Ireland, begins in Ulster. Of course, it was a London merchant house that wished to plant dairy and to start the plantation of Ulster at the very time that, at Shakespeare's time, towards the end of Shakespeare's life, that the Virginia Company is establishing a colony in Virginia.
The idea that the great glory days of England begin with Elizabeth, there is no successful English colony under the reign of Elizabeth. Great English imperial aggressive victories start happening in the 17th century, really under Cromwell, with the growth of the empire and the conquest of Jamaica. And that's when the English also began to perceive of themselves as part of a superior white race.
Oliver Cromwell is a fierce and powerful revolutionary figure. He was a great general and commander of capitalism that transformed the Atlantic, if not the whole world. This mighty vision he had of doing God's work had begun in the fens of England, where the huge hydraulic works of Van Muden in Holland are harnessed to drain the fields. So he played a role in that, and to discommon, or to remove people from their customary lands in order to produce the riches of the alluvial plains of Lincolnshire and the Norfolk Broads. He then transforms that interrelationship, shall we say, of water and land to crossing the Atlantic and to establishing the sugar plantations. He doesn't do this alone, of course. He does it with a class of people. This is why we say the capitalist class, because they hope to capitalize the land, turn the land into commodities and then into capital, and do this through the sugar plantation in the 1640s, in the very time of the English Revolution or the English Civil War. It's an amazing story of conquest, cruelty, and God.
So if you look at something like the southern states of America, up until the point of the American Civil War, the greatest amount of wealth in America was the ownership of slaves and slave labor. Now this is enormous. And it's in that process of being able to command the resources of other parts of the world, extract them for your industries and that labor, that you create this massive structural inequality.